Everything just is. The infinite just is. And its first expression, what I call the first light of creation, which again is not necessarily the light, the visual light that we're used to talking about, that first light of creation is infinitely creative. Why it creates? Well, that's a huge philosophical question. And I'm not necessarily going to try to close the door on that one, finalize that question. But it does. It, by creating means it takes on the appearance of a form. And yet the truth is it is light and it is its source in the infinite. But it takes on the appearance of a form like a dream, like a hologram. Okay? And we are all expressions of light. Our minds are expressions of light. And our minds are infinitely creative, just as creative as light is. And this is a wonderful gift, and also it can be a hindrance. Because our minds always are trying to ask why, to understand, and to interpret. And so an event happens to us, and our minds create a story. But that story is an expression of the infinite creativity of the first light, as everything is. It's just our minds mirroring the infinite creativity of the first light of creation. So we are always inventing stories, we're always interpreting, we're always helping light to take on appearances. What appearance? The appearance that we see, that we create, that we, it's everything appears to us based on our interpretation of it. That can be a personal interpretation due to our personal life circumstances, but we're also absolutely influenced by collective interpretation. I mean, we all agree that, red is red and blue is blue and so on. So things take on appearances influenced by our collective consciousness and also by our individual, the individual stories of our lives. But it's all light taking on an appearance. Okay. And if it's taking on an appearance, if it's subject to a personal or a collective interpretation, then it can also dissolve back into its source. We can see that it is just an overlay, an interpretive overlay of events. I've called it good, I've called it bad, I've called it wonderful, I've called it terrible, I've called it rich, I've called it draining, I've called it all these different things, but all those are just our interpretation of events, giving them the appearance of something. I've called it painful, I've called it enriching, okay? Again, let's look at it at a painful experience in a person's life. Some people will say, wow, that was really painful. And other people will say, oh, that was meant to happen. You're going to learn this and that from it. But those are all stories. Those are all stories. And what the person simply needs to do is to dissolve those stories in the mind and in the energetic constructs that they've created in the body. And when they do that, they see that every single way that they felt about that event was an interpretation. And that event just is. Literally, we find that those emotions, when we bring them into our heart, when we embrace them, they lose their grip. Somebody can start out feeling like this, just tense, because they don't want to feel something, because they're just scared of feeling that. And then they open to feeling that, and they bring that into their heart, and they allow themselves to feel it. And everything in the body, instead of resisting it, relaxes around it. And as soon as the body relaxes around it, it just loses its grip. That interpretation, that emotion loses its grip. It goes, we could say it just disappears into its source, which is light. So you have two children growing up in a household, essentially experiencing the same parents, the same perhaps dysfunction, the same positive things. And one of the children grows up relatively happy and the other child grows up relatively troubled. So what happened? It was the same household, the same events. There was something in that, let's say, troubled child's consciousness that caused him or her to place an interpretation on events. And what is that interpretation? It's an invention of the mind. So the mind made a judgment. The mind, we could say, created a story. And that story went deep into the cells, not just the mind, but into the cells of the body, and continued to trigger that individual throughout his or her life. So how does that person heal that interpretation of events that has gotten so stuck, not just in the mind, but in the energy system and in this cellular functioning of that person? Again, as I said earlier, there are so many teachings and techniques available. First, we have to decide that we don't want to be unhappy anymore. Some people actually are attached to being unhappy, but hopefully we all come to the point where we don't want to be unhappy anymore, and we begin to search for a way to undo that interpretation. And so we have to work to dissolve that interpretation, dissolve that story, with whatever technologies work for us, psychological, spiritual, whatever.
Technique or technology?
Technique. Yeah. We also often have to work on the physical level, because most often uncomfortable emotional energies get stuck in the body. So to dissolve that physiologically, to dissolve it psychologically, and eventually even the most painful story can come to be seen as just that. Somehow, having released all of the uncomfortable, painful energies that are associated with a particular trauma, we're able to see it as just an interpretation of an event. Then we can talk about the event. We know that that event happened to us, but all the so-called charges around that event are simply dissolved. It was just something that happened to us. We've gone through, we've been able to forgive the perpetrators. We've been able to, and forgiveness is absolutely the last stage of all healing. And finally, we see that it was just, again, all the charges are gone. It was just something that happened to us. But it can take some dedication.